Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Better Body Radio. And today I'm very excited to be joined by Coach Kassem Hanson. He's very widely regarded as an industry expert, a thought leader, and he educates coaches on individualized biomechanics, program design, and nutrition. Founder of M1 Education, has gained huge respect across the industry for his incredible knowledge of biomechanics, especially as it pertains to maximizing muscular hypertrophy, although his knowledge of program design and nutrition is equally admirable. Two opportunities that, and it's probably fair to say, and we can maybe dive into this or not, Cass, maybe opportunities that were all they seem, the industry has benefited quite largely from the creation of M1 Education and M1 training platforms. Leading a team of highly skilled coaches and educators, M1 aims to raise the bar of coaching delivery, both in person and online. I've been keen to have Kassem on the podcast since its inception for a number of reasons. One reason in particular that stands out for me is his ability to challenge the status quo and other thought leaders with a critical thinker mindset. Although it may not always be well received in an industry filled with egos and agendas, it's refreshing and I feel much needed. And I, for one, resonate with this hugely. So without further ado, Kassem, welcome to Better Body Radio.
Awesome. It's good to be here.
Awesome. So we will literally dive in. Question number one. We had a very enjoyable, lengthy chat beforehand, so I'm ready just to dive into the meat of this. So for the listeners who maybe have been living under a rock and don't know who you are and what you do, can you fill the gaps that I might have missed in your intro and just give them a little more insight into your journey to date?
So presently here in the middle of the 2020 apocalypse, I am an educator, and that's been my role for probably about 4 years now, where so even though people refer to me as Coach Kassem, I don't actually really coach individuals anymore. I coach coaches and focus on the education. But prior to that, I come from a background of biochemistry. And it's kind of funny because I started getting a lot of attention in terms of program design back when I was taking like Poliquin courses, a lot of sports stuff. And then all of a sudden, I got into a bunch of functional medicine stuff and I started being known as the nutrition guy. And that's what kind of got, my name a little bit more notoriety in the physique world. And that allowed me to work with a new class of athletes. And then, a little bit later in my journey, and around like the 2014, I started doing some stuff with biomechanics, and it just seems that the industry just looks at you as the expert in the thing that you've done the most recently. And that's kind of where I was. And now we're kind of cycling back and we're getting back into program design, and we'll see if it makes that shift. But for the main thing that I would say is, that is unique about us is everything that I've learned in, all of my years of doing this. And I've spent almost $500,000 on education, I think, at this point in time, both, university and courses. I try and just absorb everything that's out there. Is that our company, N of One, is focused on an individualized approach. So it's just like, if a system can be broken down into principles that can be applied to an individual, there's probably some merit to it. And if it can't, then it's probably a system that's based mostly on, some ulterior motive, whether that be making money or just churning out people or whatever it may be. And so that's the approach that we've taken, everything that we've learned, and we've tried to mold that model into principles that can be used. And so that's essentially what I've spent the last, 10 years of my career doing. And that's what's allowed me to be successful on, the bodybuilding stage, on the athletic development stage, and everything. Not me personally, but coaching, right? Personally, dare I say it, like I would have been a great CrossFit athlete probably if it was popular back in my day, because I'm not really good at any one thing. I'm decent at a lot of things. So, that's kind of where we're at.
It's funny you say that because I've actually competed in CrossFit. I went to regionals with a team in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I dabbled in that world, so I get it. And I came from a rugby background, so mostly rugby lads just like doing anything that's quite hard and challenging. So yeah, I can understand what you mean there. If you're kind of good at a lot of things, it definitely back then, especially 2014, CrossFit was very popular back then as well. So yeah.
Yeah. I always say that I was the champion. I was the practice champion, right? So because I could work hard through multiple drills and whatnot. So by the end of like those 2 or 3 hour practices, I could outwork a lot of people, right? But I wasn't the fastest. I wasn't the single most strongest. I didn't have the best agility. I'm obviously the, a hobbit height for anybody that's hasn't seen me. Not a very large human. So I think, CrossFit makes a very nice home for those type of athletes.
Definitely. I'm not exactly tall either. What height are you, out of interest?
I'm 5'8". So
Yeah, I mean, I'm 5'9", so I'm not exactly packing height either, so I hear you.
Yeah. When you spend the majority of your career working with high level athletes, like even though 5'8" is not that much shorter than average, when you are selectively surrounded by people that are significantly more than average, you develop the short man complex anyway. Even like if I go to the store, I'm not that short, but like 90% of the people that I interact with are a head taller than I am, right? Except for a bodybuilding, right? But then they're, a foot wider.
There you go. Exactly. Always some form of size complex going on. So that actually segues us really nicely into the second question. So bringing us to the current day as we are, and I'm sure that, I'm curious, I'm sure the listeners are as well. What was your kind of key driver or purpose for bringing the M1 concept to fruition? I guess what you touched on with the idea of N=1, for anyone who knows research and the kind of terminology, that's the population size of a study. And I like the idea, when I remember the first time you explained the N=1 concept, I was like, you know what, it makes so much sense. And unfortunately, you said we are in an industry full of, and I can't remember what the famous quote is, if it was the Emerson quote, principles are few, but if a man relies solely on methods, he's sure to fall into trouble. And I guess that's where you're probably seeing things in the industry as well. So what was your key driver for creating M1 in the first place?
So my main motivation was simply that I didn't think that I didn't think the industry had the education it deserved. I tried to take every single course option that I could, and then my career path put me in the position where I was mentoring, hundreds of trainers, and the whole process always seemed to be that everybody went to the next course because they were looking for the answer, right? They thought that course was that was going to be the one that had the key to everything. And then now I have the answer. Now I'm going to be the best coach in the world. And that will never happen. Like no course will be like, okay, cool. Here's the magic secret that we've been keeping from you this whole time. And part of that, experience is also like lack of application, because I spent a lot of time mentoring students that took the same courses that I did on just how to navigate and use that information productively. I luckily have been gifted with a good mental ability to be able to assimilate information and use it really well, especially from a broad ability to sources. But for people that doesn't come naturally too, I would see them taking the same education as me and having a totally different outcome, right? Possibly actually regressing from some of these things. And so that's what I wanted to do, is I wanted to create a platform that was education heavy and principle heavy. So you wouldn't leave with the answer, but what you would is you would leave with like kind of, almost like a roadmap for an individual of how to find that person's answer, how to solve the problems of that individual, because that's the best that we can do in an industry where you're training no two people that are the same, right? So the no course is going to say like, oh, this is, you just do, here's the magic program system that gets people lean, or this is the one that gets people big. And, here's it's like, it's not, right? Everybody's diet, everybody's training thing, what's optimal for them is going to be specific for them. And that's why we're principle heavy, so that instead of saying, well, here's my system or my method, there's a degree of that you need to have from a business perspective. But in reality, once you start to like take every person in as their own unique problems and go about solving that, you're going to get much better results. And I think that the thing that's often overlooked is when you take an N=1 approach, every client is a very good educational experience on its own. So when people leave our courses, their education continues through their experience, right? Because now they're getting to see these case studies. Now they're getting to troubleshoot these things with principles. Whereas if you just have a methodology or a system, when it doesn't work, you're just kind of like, I don't know why it didn't work, And so then what do we do? Do we double down harder, And that's where you see a lot of the very poor decision-making processes of like, well, okay, we're just going to throw in a bunch of activity or decrease food a bunch or whatever it may be. It's like, I don't know. So I'm just going to drastically change the big rocks, when in reality it could have been a small tweak that would have just made this person's life and their journey significantly easier and more sustainable.
Brilliant. I mean, there's so many little important, I think, messages for especially the coaches listeners to take away from that. And I think one of the things I saw is I think I told you when we were kind of exchanging email that I was looking to create just at least a basic biomechanics course here initially, because there's nothing like that out here in the Middle East. But with that exact same concept in mind, you guys have a fantastic structure with what you do with the hybrid, where there's the kind of the theory online, but then there's a huge push on the right where you need to come and attend the practical to really show how well have you synthesized and how well can you apply this knowledge. And I think if you look at the industry over, as long as it's been around, it's been very much a case of you turn up to your 2-3 day weekend courses, you have a whole bunch of information just vomited at you. There's no way you could retain most of it. Well, maybe 5-10% if you're someone like you who's maybe really good at retaining the information, but for the rest it's maybe 1 or 2 nuggets and the rest gets forgotten. And like you said, almost it's kind of right, well, let's take your money, let's educate you for 3 days and then see you later, you don't hear from us again. I think what you guys are doing, which is so great, is that it's not about teaching. Sure, you need a baseline of information, you need to have knowledge, you need to also take on that knowledge first, but what you're doing is you're teaching people how to think rather than just regurgitate. And I think I like a term that often used is the idea of people just learn choreography, but they don't learn how to move, like how to feel it, how to just let for it to become intrinsic to, right, I see this and I know how to address that.
Yeah. The way that I kind of describe a lot of the education systems right now, and this carries all the way down to the way people post on social media, is that they overdose on complexity and underdose on context. Right? So it's like people may be confused thinking, man, there was so much information, but it's like, wait, but was there a lot of information, or was there just there's a lot of stuff, but is it really knowledge? I guess it was a lot of information, but did you actually gain knowledge from that information, right? Because I can read like a 500-page manual on my oven if I want to, or whatever the hell, but that's not necessarily knowledge that's useful for me, even though I will have obtained a bunch of information on the way that thing works and all of its stuff, right? So attaining knowledge from a course requires context, and that is the thing that seems to be lacking. There's a lot of overcomplicating things and undercontextualizing them.
That's a great way to summarize that. And I'm going to leave that question there because I think that sums everything up nicely. Now, I want to dive into some of the more, and I know we kind of spoke on via email about there's only so much we can do this justice because we haven't got visuals, we haven't got the we can't practically show people examples or anything like that. But I just want to touch on a few, I suppose, key kind of discussion points that I've seen a lot on your social media that's kind of come up numerous times over the kind of past maybe 6 months to a year. And I think it's something that a lot of people, certainly our audience, haven't been exposed to much, or maybe haven't been given context from someone who really understands this stuff inside and out. So we're going to start with this question. For anyone that follows you on social media, all they will have heard you discuss this idea or the dangers of getting caught up in what is often termed intention or sensation-based training. And there's certain individuals out there who are very much popularized and are profiting off of teaching these methods, shall we say. Can you elaborate on what this exactly is, this idea of kind of intent or sensation-based training, and why should we be focusing more on creating an effective stimulus from our training rather than sensation?
So the first thing is to understand that sensation is a complicated thing when it comes towards what it actually correlates with, right? So when you think of like what our natural feedback mechanisms is, if you're around in the world doing things, you tend to get sensation of when you need to be like aware of something. If you touch something hot, you get, your body makes you aware of that. If you're cold, right? If you go to slip, all of a sudden you feel your whole body like tense up, right? And so a lot of sensation is a negative feedback, meaning that's not a like, oh, this is an awesome thing that you're doing. It's more like, hey, stop doing whatever it is that you're doing. And so when we look at exercise, that's one aspect that can come into it. And then we also have the sensation that we get with just like the accumulation of fluid and like the, the feeling of like the pump based sensations. There's different things different sensations we can get neurologically when a tissue is fully stretched, fully short. So there's so many things that could give us a feeling or a sensation. And for the average person, or even, I would say even the more advanced person, to be able to separate out, like, well, what does this feeling mean? Does that mean I'm doing it right or not? Is extremely difficult. It's like way too much to ask, especially of a client that you're training. And so if we want to know whether or not what we're doing is actually productive, I don't say that like, well, a person shouldn't feel something, but if they're going to feel something, they should feel something on top of it making sense from a biomechanical and a loading perspective, right? Because there's a lot of times where we can do something that from loading the muscle that we want to doesn't necessarily make sense if you really know the anatomy, but there's a tremendous sensation. And that means more than likely it's one of those negative sensations, meaning that it's like, okay, this is the body saying, try not to do this. So anytime we destabilize a joint, we're going to become hyper aware of things around that joint, right? Because we need to be. Our body's predicting that we're about ready to injure ourselves. So it's going to make us really feel everything around that, just like, you know, if you were trying to slip. And when we look at our industry, a lot of people like to be, they like to be sold on instant gratification. And so you can make, I call them like almost like these parlor trick movements where you can position a joint or somebody somewhere and make them do something. And there will be this super heightened sensation, which doesn't actually ever happen when things are working properly. And there, as a business model, some people took that and ran with it because it was so easy, right? It was, you know, it's modern day. It's like the equivalent of, you know, snake oil in the biomechanics industry of like, oh, hey, look, I can do this thing here. And ooh, you feel that cool. Then that must be the way that you do it because you can feel that thing. When in reality, and I've done this example a million times, is I'll have people just say, hey, you know, just take your elbow at like 90 degrees, put your other arm over it and just flex into it hard. So, you know, you're creating a ton of tension. It's not that much sensation, right? Like your bicep doesn't like start shooting rainbows out because you're creating tension in it. But if you were to do something like, you know, yanking your arm over your head and twisting it around, and then you contract your bicep, you're going to get like this really extreme sensation. But that's because of all the co-contraction and joint stability issues that are having to accommodate that position, not because, well, this is an amazing bicep exercise. So sensation is one of those things where the correlation is so bad. It's a very poor goal to set in training because it can mislead you more often than not, especially if you don't have the biomechanics knowledge to discern whether this sensation even has the possibility of being a positive, you know, indicator.
Yeah. So I think this will be a good chance before I go on to the next question, actually maybe dive into a few examples that maybe people can easily visualize and relate to. So some of the ones that I've seen a lot of, and we can maybe like, you can unpack this in a nice way. Let's just say leaning forward in the leg extension is a really popular one that's now starting to be done. People are sitting super far forward, and a really deep amount of hip flexion and doing leg extensions. And maybe people aren't aware of, you know, concepts like active insufficiency and things like that. You maybe explain to people like what, you know, people might see someone do that and think, oh wow, that feels like it's burning so much more, or feel it so much more. But why? And let's just take the leg extension example. Why is that specifically a bad exercise setup?
Yeah, so when we have two joint muscles, which the rectus femoris, which is a quad that crosses the knee and the hip, meaning that it can get shorter by either extending the knee or flexing the hip. All of those two joint muscles are very easy to get to a point of passive insufficiency because we can shorten two joints instead of one. And really, they're kind of meant to kind of help communicate one static joint while moving at the other and kind of knowing when we're about ready to lose stability or I would say like optimal force output. So if you're in a leg extension and you lean forward at the hip, we're shortening that muscle there, but all the rest of your quads can still extend the knee all the way to lockout. But what will happen as they do that is your rec fem will get to the point where it's so short now that it's fighting just to maintain, like, we'll say not necessarily tension, but just enough communication to know that, hey, I'm still attached to the bones, right? Because when a muscle literally loses tension because it's over shortened, your body actually has like a little bit of a neurological panic because it's like, without tension in this, I don't even know where it is, how it is, or it's essentially your body loses connection with it in some way, shape, or form. Like it can't evaluate what's going on with that tissue if it's over shortened. And so what you're going to get is you're going to get almost like this crampy sensation in that tissue, which is going to feel like, wow, this is working really hard, when in reality it's working very inefficiently, right? And if we're at a point where it's over shortened, it can't create tension. So I think a big thing that people need to understand is tension. It requires two things. It requires the muscles to actually be pulling from the inside, but it also requires resistance to be pulling from the outside of that tissue. So if we put any muscle in a position where the resistance that we're using can't really act on it, like it doesn't matter how hard you contract it, you're not getting stimulatory tension in there, right? So it's just a muscle, you know, crossing those, you know, contractile filaments does not tension make. You have to have something on the other side, right? That's resisting that force that actually gives us the tension that stimulates, you know, the hypertrophy that we're after.
Yeah, and it's funny, there was you might even be able to name the paper, but there was a paper that was done not too long ago. I don't know if you saw that, but actually comparing the leg extension with the lean forward and lean back. I know Kassem Hanson certainly posted about it.
Yeah.
It just very clearly displayed what was the force output with both positions, and it was a no-brainer. It was as the machine was designed with the sitting back to keep the hip in a little bit more of a slightly more extended position, and that was one out, right? So that, I think, funny enough, we don't have enough of this research. I think that's part of the issue something as well. We don't have enough of this research to that's kind of explored these different comparisons to let people know. But that was just funny how there was just such a clear, right, let's test this and really put it in there, and it wasn't even close in the end, I don't think.
And that's one of the things about spending some time to really learn good biomechanics and good anatomy is that, you know, you don't need to know, or you don't need to have a research study on every single muscle in the body, because it's like, okay, this same thing applies for the hamstrings on a leg curl, right? If you hip extend and then you try and do a leg curl, you run into the same problem. If you over shoulder flex and try and do a bicep curl, you end up in the same problem. If you over shoulder extend and try and so it's one of these things where if you learn the physical properties of this stuff and you learn how to actually visualize how this stuff is moving, you can be like, oh, well, that's not going to work, right? You know, and then again, it's a principle-based thing. Once you have that principle-based thing, you can start evaluating every joint and every muscle in the body and applying that to the exercises and the individual and whatnot. Because you will get some people that will have more mobility than others that could maybe benefit from a tiny bit of flexion or whatever. But then how would you go and figure that out? That's where knowing the principles, be like, okay, how would I be able to tell if a person's actually still shortening their rec fem by flexing a little bit further forward versus not, right? And we use a simple thing where we have somebody lock their knee out and then actually try to flex the hip a little bit more without actually moving the pelvis or the trunk, so that the psoas and the iliacus wouldn't be getting involved, you know, and we can see, all right, like that right there. So maybe if I want to truly shorten that thing, I know where that end range exists. But otherwise it'd be like, well, I don't know, like, do I just have them lean back because I know I don't want them to be fully shortened, even though I may want to actually fully shorten that rec fem, because there's going to be benefit to taking it through its full range of motion. So if you learn the anatomy and you learn some of these principles, then you can investigate these things on an individual basis, right? Rather, because if a study says, well, yeah, you know, it showed better force output at, you know, 110 degrees hip flexion instead of 90 degrees or whatever it may be, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case for every individual. Some person might be able to fully shorten at 80 degrees and another person at 130 degrees of hip flexion.
And I've definitely seen that with clients practically. Sometimes it's they either do really well sitting right back, or for some you might have to put something there to kind of support the back so they are sitting a bit more upright. And like you said, hugely individual. I think, like you said as well, with knowing the principles, say, for example, you know how biarticular muscle groups work. For example, you know that, right? Well, take the hamstring, the Gironda hamstring curl is something I see so many coaches doing. I don't know who's been popularizing that in recent times. I know it was very popular a long time ago as well. But we kind of know, like, okay, well, the hamstring can either extend the hip or it can flex the knee. It can't do both well at the same time. And so we don't have a research paper on that, but taking the same principles, you applied it to the leg extension, it just kind of makes sense. Now, don't get me wrong, again, like you said, some clients do really well, really clamping the glutes that little bit more, but others just keeping the hips a bit more relaxed seems to work a lot better. So it's so interesting that you've kind of obviously come across this, but I think you're, at least for me, one of the first people that explained it in a way that just made it was simple and it made sense and didn't overcomplicate things, which is something we obviously talked about off air as well. So that kind of segues us, I think, really nicely into the fourth question. So another important concept that I see you touch on often is the importance of understanding functional anatomy in practice, practically, versus just kind of regurgitating the traditional kind of textbook anatomy rhetoric. Can you explain how you define functional anatomy for biomechanics, and then perhaps provide a few simple examples as best as possible within the audio format that the podcast allows?
So functional anatomy, when I'm looking at, when we're teaching that, is we're looking at how a muscle is going to interact through its basically all possible ranges of motion. Because that's essentially what you're going to do when you pick an exercise, is you're going to look at an exercise, you're going to look at how it moves, and you need to know how a muscle is going to function within that individual movement and how you can tweak that movement to bias that to one tissue or another, or to favor the joint better, the joint mechanics better. When we look at like textbook level anatomy, the functions that are listed in that are, you'll see like this list, like a muscle may have like 2, or it may have like 8 functions. And that's very misleading when we say like, okay, these are the functions, this is what this does, because there's no context. Because what a muscle does is it pulls from its origin to insertion. The action that creates at the joint is going to be subjective of where that limb happens to be in space. It's how are these 2 points orientated from each other, right? So if we were thinking like we're on a clock, right? And I'm holding a string and you're holding a string. If I'm at 6 and you're at noon and I pull, well, then that's a nice straight line there, right? But if you move over in a different direction, right, and I pull, well, now it's a different angle of pull. And that's essentially what's happening in exercises, like when we're chest pressing from different angles, or we're pulling from different angles. And there's a lot of nuances that happen with like things like the hip, where you have a femur that's got like a little neck thing on it that like starts to change like the vector that the leg's going to move as it goes into more hip extension or more flexion or abduction or whatever. So when we look at functional anatomy, it's understanding, well, how would this work so that I can apply that principle to any position that I would end up being. And part of that understanding is knowing what the true end ranges of that muscle are. Because essentially, if you know what a muscle's actual fully shortened position is, you know that, okay, if I'm actually using this, no matter where I'm coming from, that's the destination I'm going towards. So I don't need a list of functions of like, well, this internally rotates and it abducts and like all, and it's like, no, it goes that way. Because that's really what it does in that context. How much of all of these, all of these words or adjectives that we're going to give it, how much of that does is going to be dependent on where it's coming from, and also what the load is doing to it, how much load, what the force is of all of these other muscles that are going to interact on these things. For instance, I was just having a discussion with a guy the other day. I was looking at a manual and it had the adductor magnus and the glute max listed as antagonist, right? When in reality, they're both hip extenders. But in one aspect, they do share a slightly antagonistic relationship in terms of a little bit of rotation on the femur. But they're kind of, if you kind of think of it, it's like, well, one guy's on one side, one guy's on the other, and they're really pulling together to keep that femur neutral. They're not really antagonists, they're more synergistic. So depending on the context that you look at things, the relationship between different tissues can change, right? So some people will be like, well, the pec is an internal rotator. And I'm like, but it doesn't ever do just internal rotation on its own. Like you would never isolate internal rotation separate from just pulling towards its insertion. So how much it internally rotates depends upon all of the things that are also having somewhat of an external rotation vector, on it. So the big things that I can give people without visualization is just that understand that the majority of your get out of your textbook comes from the anatomical position, and it's the list of all the possible forces, not necessarily function. So if you see that list on there, chances are that muscle doesn't do any of those things in isolation. What its movement does in that specific picture that you're looking at is it does all of those things in combination to varying degrees. Okay. which from a gym floor perspective is really irrelevant if you learn the visual of, okay, for this person, if they're focusing on this, here's where their limb needs to end up being. Like, it's so, it doesn't matter how many adjectives it takes to get there, as long as you go to that direction in the most efficient manner, right? And if we're trying to target a specific tissue and you know it's fully shortened and it's fully lengthened range, then it's very simple. Then you have an arc that it's like, okay, that's all I'm trying to do is I'm trying to achieve that motion, right? There may be 5 different things that we could label are going on at different rates throughout that range of motion, but none of that is important as long as I have that proper arc. So functional anatomy is knowing the total range of motion and the function of a muscle irrespective of the joint position, right? So because you have to know what it's going to do in real life, not a bunch of words that do not give you the proper context of how this thing actually functions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you put it really well. It must have been a recent post that you did about the idea of, like, if you're not already able to do something in a bit of an intuitive way, and once the nervous system starts to get that excitation from obviously reaching fatigue and a high level of perceived threat and stress, good luck trying to keep it dialed in when you get to that stage, because if you're not already doing it, forget if you're trying to add in all, like you say, all those other 5 or 6 things that you're thinking about trying to do. I think, like, you even see it with, I think you've done this example of the lats before as well, like, and that, you touched on a great point that people often don't think about, that biomechanics isn't a set destination. It moves and changes depending on the context that you're doing. So for example, working the lats in the length into mid-range, there's going to be a movement there that you can get really decent loading out of, but it's not a great option for trying to shorten the lats, because certain loads just don't lend well to, having that little bit of flexion and rotation and everything else. There might be another movement that's going to achieve that a lot better. But then on the other side, then people try to get so fancy with it, and they're trying to achieve both of those things at the same time, or they're trying to do 4 or 5 different exercises to achieve all of those different functions. What would be the kind of, I suppose, and this is a bit of a side question, what would be the advice you would give to coaches from just a really, really basic standpoint from program design when it comes to selecting exercises? Just if they're trying to work a tissue to its, I suppose, get the maximum stimulus to its entire contractile range, what would be the number one thing you would advise coaches to think about?
One, don't get greedy and try and make an exercise something that it's not, right? So I think a lot of people do that. They try and be like, well, if I add this and this and add this cue and add all these other things, that you think you're going to get all these benefits. And the reality is, once you're actually properly loading it, you're going to get what the exercise gives you, where your body is going to come up with the best solution to that. And so that's where, when you're picking an exercise, look at what is the best attribute of this, right? And focus on that. Don't try and focus on filling in all the little gaps. Occasionally we can do something with accommodating resistance to, make a resistance profile more favorable, but oftentimes there's not a lot of things that we can do to, like, how could we make this part of the range of motion more effective or something by adding an extra cue or extra vector or whatnot. Usually those things are very, very tiny little additions that have minimal, so you should never be doing an exercise for the little, like, sprinkles that you're going to put on it with your cues or whatever. You should be doing it for, like, this is built for this. This is what it does well, right? So, and then if you do that, then if you pick an exercise that works the shorten and works the lengthen, or there's some overlap or whatever it may be, then you have it covered, right? But if you're like, well, I want to train to full range of motion, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this exercise and I'm going to add like 16 cues to it and put a bunch of bands and, like, do all these weird contortions with it to try and make it a more complete exercise. What you're probably doing is just making it suck at its entirety, right? Like, so you may have brought up the worst part of it up 10%, but the best part of it you dropped like 60%. And so now doing that exercise has completely lost its purpose.
Yeah, I think that sums up incredibly well. And I think, like you said, what are you actually going to be able to achieve progressive overload over a period of time across multiple cycles of training, right? Hey guys, Coach Ross here. I hope you enjoyed part 1 with Coach Kassem Hanson, creator of M1 Education. I'm sure you agree, very fascinating stuff and fantastic answers as far as it pertains to functional anatomy versus textbook anatomy. And of course, one of the big kind of talking points in the industry at the moment is this idea of kind of sensation-based training or intent-based training versus, eliciting an effective stimulus. So fantastic part 1. If you guys have any questions whatsoever on part 1 that you would like to dig into deeper, just shoot us a direct message on Instagram at Better Body Collective, or alternatively on this YouTube video, you can just drop a comment in the comment section below. Stay tuned for part 2. So we felt like that was a good time to end it, even though it didn't take up exactly half of the video. That covered kind of the first 2 points of the podcast really, really well. And it kind of left nicely for a very long, lengthy discussion, which I knew it would be around progressive overload. It's something that Coach Kassem is spending a lot of time on at the moment. He's about to release a course on progressive overload. They just literally bought a lab recently to start doing a lot of different studies and experiments for themselves. And so I thought, and as expected, it ended up being a good amount of time spent on that topic, and rightfully so. I asked him to define what he felt progressive overload was, and then we dove into a few different examples of where that may, what sort of contexts we potentially will find ourselves looking at as coaches when it comes to program design, and maybe what are some of the key considerations about, kind of contrasting between this idea of doing maybe volume-based progressions and methods of training setup versus maybe more of the intensification or kind of lower volume, high intensity type setups. So very interesting discussion. Even as a little bonus, we even dove into the importance of potentially matching up nutrition with training demands. So you do not want to miss part 2. We dive into plenty in that episode. And we give Coach Kassem an opportunity to, of course, tell you guys where you can see him most. If you want to go check him out now, go over to @n1_education or @n1_training on Instagram. If you want to check out Coach Kassem himself, @coach_Kassem. We'll put all of the information in the show notes below. And as usual, guys, the best way you can support us is to go onto Apple, leave us a 5-star review, or if you're just viewing on any of your other preferred podcast stations, then just keep tuning in every single week and we'll keep those episodes coming. Thanks so much very much, guys, and we look forward to seeing you next episode.